Now, this timing of Ruskin writing about Turner and writing about landscape was at the beginning of what we now are very familiar with, but was essentially a mass marketing of printed materials. Modern painters went through several editions published in London and in New York. It was probably the first instance of literally tens of thousands of readers being introduced to an artist, likely that no other artist living at the time had ever been written about so extensively and read about by so many people. But I'm stressing this notion of reading because, again, the opportunities to see actual works by the artist were few and far between. Indeed, early on, Frederick Church, who had been Thomas Cole's pupil, had the honor paid to him in his 1849 painting called West Rock, New Haven, of saying that the way he depicted water in that rose to what Ruskin felt was a realistic depiction. So Ruskin, as a yardstick to say what's good about a painting, is already being applied to American artists at the time, even while Turner is still alive, that a painting like West Rock, of course, stylistically, has very little or nothing to do with Turner's art. Ruskin's writing also caught the notice of people like the wealthy collector of books and art, James Lennox of New York, who actually, without ever having seen a Turner, but having read about them, wrote to a friend of his in London and said, "Could you acquire a painting by Turner for me and send it?" And at first, in 1845, when his friend, the American-born but expatriate artist Charles Robert Leslie, went to Turner and said that he had a wealthy American friend who wanted to pay good money for an oil, Turner said, no, they won't come up to scratch. He didn't think that there was any active group of patrons in America that could compete with his patrons already in England. But when Charles Leslie said 500 pounds, that caught Turner's attention. And he said, "Oh, well, you could have that, or that." Leslie picked the painting on the left, which is a dark slide of a painting which is on view in the exhibition called Staffa, Fingal's Cave. That's the first oil painting to come to this country, to America, by Turner. And as far as I can tell, the first oil painting by Turner to leave in terms of being sold and owned outside of Britain. And that came in 1845. And when James Lennox opened the crate, or had it opened for him, and looked at the painting, he said back in a letter to Leslie that, well, he did admire it, but it seemed a bit indistinct. But he asked Leslie not to tell Turner that. But as it happened to be, not long after Leslie received that letter, he did see Turner, and Turner said, "What did that American think of my painting?" To which Leslie truthfully said he found it a bit indistinct. And Turner replied in a phrase that became corrupted in America by a mistranslation. Turner actually replied, "Tell him indistinctness is my fault." But in an early biography, that was transferred to, "Tell him indistinctness is my forte." That was a later era looking at Turner and seizing on this. In any event, Leslie said to Lennox, "Live with the painting a while. I think you'll come to like it." And indeed, Leslie wrote back saying after a while that he had come to like the painting and even convinced a few of his friends to admire it. But he said he'll never be a favorite with the crowd. Leslie bought a second Turner, the work on the right, also in the exhibition, in 1850, called Fort Vieux, a scene of an English warship aground on a French beach being bombarded by the French artillery. These two paintings were in New York then from 1845 and 1850. Some of you may know they were in the New York Public Library's art collection until the 1950s when they were sold. So a pattern which has continued in recent years of selling off the library's collection. Lennox, of course, founded what is now the New York Public Library. But Lennox also let artists come to see his collection, and one of them was Frederick Church, who painted in 1851, I think, after seeing the painting on the right by Turner of Fort Vieux, an extraordinarily similar, stark image, not of a ship, but of a solitary beacon off the Maine coast. This is called Beacon off Mount Desert, with this extraordinary, in this case, sunrise sky. Nothing about the handling of paint necessarily associates itself with Turner, but the image, the forcefulness, the starkness of it did. And for one of the earliest instances in American art criticism, an American painter is being compared and held up now as worthy of such comparison with Turner. Church, from this point on in his career, from 1851, would constantly be compared to Turner. 1851 was also the year that Turner died. He died without any obvious person to continue his legacy. No students, as we've heard, other than students he had in the Royal Academy as a professor of architecture of perspective and drawing. And if he became more and more thought of as a kind of one-time eccentricity in British painting, but in America, where landscape painting was on the rise, on the ascendant, maybe perhaps his true legacy was in the New World. And indeed, over the course of the 1850s, Church would demonstrate a vision of landscape, a heroic kind of painting of the natural world, such as this grand scene in the Andes, called the Andes of Ecuador, a painting now literally on a Turnerian scale. This is an 8-foot wide painting, comparable to something like the Hannibal that we've seen earlier. He demonstrated not just the scope and the sort of sheer energy of Turner's style, but he also demonstrated a clear awareness of certain signature techniques of Turner, like the glowing disk of the sun in the atmosphere, filling the entire canvas with radiant light and air. He also became famous, not just in America, but internationally, and especially in Britain, for enormous, powerful landscapes like Niagara of 1857 on the left, or the Heart of the Andes here in the Metropolitan Collection of 1859. Even in Britain, where these paintings were shown, critics began to say, maybe the next Turner is not here in England, but over there in America. And one critic wrote of the Heart of the Andes, on this American, more than any other, does the mantle of our greatest landscape painter seem to have been passed. One observer who saw Church at Niagara saw his sketches of Niagara and said, "Why, my goodness, you're awfully good. When did you come over?" To which Church said that he was born in Hartford, Connecticut. And indeed, comparing Church to Turner became such a commonplace that it inspired ridicule and satire. A man named John Frankenstein read a review in the Atlantic Monthly that lauded Church, talked of him as the next great figure in landscape painting, the true legitimate successor to Turner. And Frankenstein wrote a long poem called American Art, Its Awful Attitude and Altitude. And he said in there, take the Atlantic Monthly. There you'll find Church and Turner, ye gods and little fishes, but don't they serve up some curious dishes? This notion that somehow the spirit of Turner might transatlantically be recreated in America began to seem, perhaps, at least to some, an impossibility, if not an outright absurdity. But Church, as I've said, did not try strictly or slavishly to imitate Turner's actual style. That fell to a number of other artists who literally were interested in becoming known as the American Turner. And of those, I'll single out just the most obvious, Thomas Moran. Again, English-born, but came at an early age to this country. And you see on the right a Moran watercolor of a scene in Yellowstone compared with a Swiss Turner, a late Turner watercolor, the Lake of Zug of 1843. Moran first went to Britain, to England in 1862, made numerous trips over the course of his career, spent time at the British Museum where Turner's works on paper were then housed, going meticulously through the watercolors, the sketchbooks, everything that he could see, and studying Turner's technique.